You're listening to The Interactome, a podcast by a group of young researchers who want to connect you to the world of science by sharing their stories and perspectives. Just in case their bosses are listening, they want to remind you that the opinions expressed here are their own. They also want to remind you not to take anything they say as medical or professional advice, as they are not doctors. Not yet, anyway. Stay tuned about that. And, without further ado, welcome to the Interactome.
Hi everyone, I'm Sam LaRussa. I am returning to the Interactome. I think we've been doing some relatively small scale episodes recently, which is great, but hi, if you've forgotten who I am. I am a biochemistry PhD student, and actually for this episode, I'm mainly going to be focusing on the fact that I am actually not the person who's posting all of our stuff on our Twitter. We have a wonderful, dedicated social media person, Natalie, who has a lot of experience with science communication and with picking articles and things to share with people. And so I wanted to start off by asking a question to her about how we find the articles that we share on our social media. So this episode is going to be primarily focused on sources. So where do we get our information from? How do we interpret it? And how do we know what is reputable and what might not be? And so we're just going to kind of each talk about our personal experience with this. And hopefully this episode will be a little bit easier to follow. I'll be trying out a new format where we'll be having one person speak about their experiences and then commenting on that and then moving on to the next. And each person's going to have their own individual focuses.
Awesome. Yeah, Sam, thank you for that introduction. We as a group decided that this is such an important topic to cover because especially in the age of social media, there's so much information out there and it can get overwhelming to decipher where information comes from and what's to be trusted. So I'll give a little background on what I do for social. When I'm drafting social for Interactome for the following week, I always stick to sources that I know fact check, always stick to sources that I know will cite studies that they talk about. So that's kind of where I start, but I'm gonna backtrack a bit and start with a personal anecdote. So my background is in science communication, and in 2018 I was an intern at WGBH Nova. So they are a part of PBS. They do science documentaries, and my internship was focused entirely on fact checking. It was my job to go through every documentary that Nova made that hadn't been published yet and go through every scientific claim, every factual claim that was in the documentary and find not one, but two trusted sources to support that claim. And the reason you always want two is because you want, I don't know, I just feel like one, it sounds silly to say, but one just isn't enough. Like anybody can kind of come up with one claim, but if you have multiple separate trusted sources saying the same thing, then it becomes more reputable. Maybe that's not the best way to explain it. And anyone feel free to jump in on that, but you always want two. And I think when you're looking at places that report on science, they follow a similar suit where they're like, if one study says having a cat, will reduce the risk of heart disease. It's like, okay, well, who else says that? Who else? And that's not something that has a study that's been done to my knowledge. I'm really just kind of pulling that out of thin air. But yeah, websites like Healthline, if we ever tweet an article by Healthline, I believe we have in the past, if you click on those articles, which I hope you all do, follow us on Twitter, by the way, at The Interactome, you will always see at the top, I believe it's the top right-hand corner, it'll say the author, and then it'll say medically fact-checked by. And you'll have that trusted person who's reviewing this material before it goes live with that strong background being like, this is accurately presented in this article. This is, trustworthy. So that's the kind of stuff I look for. on news organizations like the Washington Post, NPR, they typically will, when they report on science, those aren't just science entity news organizations, right? They report on breaking news, on the economy, things like that. But embedded in the articles, oftentimes they will hyperlink their own sources in the claims. So you get kind of, when you're reading an article and it's a few words are highlighted blue and they're underlined and you can click that and that's another article. That's them citing their claim. So they do that as well. And then using those citations, you can kind of backtrack and find where all this information comes from and see kind of how it snowballs into the information that's presented in front of you through the news cycle. And I guess one more point that I'll add is on science news, that's another publication that we frequently tweet about. Science News is actually maybe one of the most popular trusted websites that I guess I kind of gravitate to when I'm developing social content. And they always, I shouldn't say always, but the most of the time in the articles that I tend to pick have citations at the bottom of the articles that will link to the specific paper that they're researching, so you can go kind of look through the data, see how the paper was or the research was structured, how like what the methods were, and we'll get into methods and papers later on in this episode. But just wanted to give a little bit of background on how we find our sources with what we want to, what information we want to share with you guys, and things to look out for when you're reading about science in the news. What are some green flags? Green flags are the paper is cited, and it's like, okay, as a reader, I can go back and I can double check those claims on my own accord. And one thing that I think is particularly important to be wary of, because I see this a lot also in the age of social media, be wary of blanket statements and blanket claims, and I'll get into what that means. We've all seen those articles, where it's promoted material on CNN or whatever, and it's those articles that have those absurd pictures on the bottom or whatever, like what I'm talking about. A lot of times those articles might be titled, "Eat this to prevent cancer," and it's like, oh, well, that's good and dandy. The food that they're talking about doesn't prevent cancer. For example, if you've got an article telling you, if you eat blueberries, you reduce the risk of cancer. In a way, that can be construed as somewhat true, but it's pretty removed because blueberries and fruit, they are packed with antioxidants and they reduce the amount of free oxygen radicals in your body. And while free oxygen radicals have been linked to increased likelihood of cancer, eating blueberries or food that are high in antioxidants is not going to prevent you from genetic predispositions to cancer or all genetic mutations that could lead to cancer. So it's making sure you look at information with a critical eye.
That, I feel like that definitely covers kind of how our social media stuff happens. So I guess anyone can chime in here. But I definitely think that I was like, should I interrupt you with the two sources thing? I don't really have like anything like super great to say about that. But in my experience, when we have one person saying something, no matter how brilliant a scientist they are or how great they are at vetting sources or anything, we all make mistakes. And I think instead of being like, oh, well, if you only have one source, it could be, it's like it's not as good or something. It's like, well, having one source means that you're relying on one person not to make a mistake, one entity not to make a mistake.
That's a great point, Sam.
Yeah. And like, I'm coming off of a week of a few mistakes. So like, I'm sitting here like, no, you know what? Like if I ran the lab I was in and nobody ever questioned me, or, if nobody ever questioned my boss or whatever, we'd be in a lot more trouble than we're in. Because we all make mistakes, scientists included, sometimes especially. I feel like as a job, being a scientist involves making a lot of mistakes and learning from them. So two sources means someone had to make the same mistake twice, provided the sources are separate enough.
And hey, if you have 3 or 4 sources, even better. The more you can support the claim, the better. But going exactly, Sam said it so eloquently. You can't just rely on one person for a claim. It's important to double check and have that kind of backbone.
I don't know if anyone else has got anything to chime in about this.
Nothing other than the fact of that's kind of what I use to evaluate the news too. Like, I know we're talking about science here, but I find that if I can find a story that has a consensus across a bunch of different news sources that I know are biased towards one way or another, if they're all kind of reporting on the same thing, then I'm like, okay, I think it's trustworthy. Or at least, more trustworthy than if I just took one random news article and was like, yes, all my eggs in this one basket.
I do think in the day and age of the internet, always just be aware of the fact that they could just be copying the same thing, which sucks. But
yeah, that's also true.
Yeah, it's.
But I guess big point is like consensus is usually pretty good.
Yeah. So next up, I wanted to have Sarah actually talk about how to read papers, since we talked a lot about them, but I'm sure a lot of listeners don't have a ton of experience looking at them. Of course, a word of caution coming from me as someone who has to read papers, it's hard. And it takes years of practice to actually get decent at it, weirdly enough, but figured we might as well give y'all an introduction to what that's like.
So I'm going to speak to as many different backgrounds and levels of expertise as I can here. So bear with me. I don't mean to talk down to anybody or talk kind of too high up in the clouds either. So first thing I wanted to discuss, or at least touch on, was a search engine called PubMed. It is run by the NIH, so the National Institute of Health. It's a government website, and it basically compiles a giant database of a bunch of scientific articles out there. And it's a very useful resource. You can search articles by title, by topic. You can find pretty much anything you'd ever want to find on the website. And I've used it in a bunch of my own projects. I actually don't think I've ever had a project where I haven't used it. And that's awesome. It also depends what kind of project I'm doing, how I end up using PubMed. So I'll also talk about within this kind of the structure of a research article, or just a research paper in general. There's an abstract, there's an introduction, methods, results, discussion, and then sometimes like a conclusion of sorts, as well as citations, figures, supplemental information. And basically each article that's published in the scientific world is usually, and I'll also talk about the other angle of this, is usually published in a journal. And those journals have different requirements for what they consider to be an acceptable part of the research paper. So most papers generally have all of those aspects, though they may be organized in slightly different ways each time. And so each journal has their own formatting, and that's specific to them. So that's something scientists keep in mind. But generally, the two types of articles that I've come across the most so far are research articles. So your classic science experiments, you form a hypothesis, you test that hypothesis, etc. And then there's also types of articles called literature reviews. And I can let Joe talk about this more too. But literature reviews are basically kind of a scientist or a resource company, organization, school, whatever you have it, whoever's writing the research article, they're combining a bunch of different research articles into one kind of reference paper. So if I were to do a literature review on cancer, I would go on a source or search engine like PubMed or Google Scholar, and I would type in, pancreatic cancer. And I would just look at the most recent papers, I'd see what I find, and I would start kind of filtering through and see what the most updated science is out there. And for that, I would go through the abstracts of each paper. So reading a research paper can get very intimidating very fast. And I often still get intimidated, and I've been reading research papers for a while. For me, I don't know if that's ever going to go away, because sometimes you see giant, what looks like the most complicated figure ever, and you're like, oh my God, or like the statistical test that you have no idea what it is, or you need to research more on it yourself because you're like, wow, I completely forget what that is. Abstracts are really good for sorting out which papers you want to give your full attention to, or you want to get really, really deep into the details with. So for something like literature review, it's super helpful because your abstract is basically your summary of the paper. It's your TLDR. It'll tell you what the paper's about, how they kind of went about doing the experiment, if it was an experiment, what was discussed, what they found, basically the main takeaways. And so that really makes it helpful to sort by different topics, and all around just very useful. So, I know I kind of rambled on there, but I would say the other aspect I wanted to touch on in terms of finding research papers and just kind of how they're distributed that I've come across is something called preprint. So these are basically, I don't know if they're technically journals by definition. Maybe someone can jump in on that. But basically any research article I've come across is either in a journal or a preprint journal. So something like Bio RXIV, Med RXIV, those are ones that I've used the most. So a lot of times there is, and maybe this isn't something we can talk about for another episode, I feel like scientists have a love-hate relationships with journals just because they are very complicated to publish in sometimes. And sometimes you just want to get your research out there. And, you know, if it's peer-reviewed and you feel like it's a good study, you want to share it with everybody. And so journals can have certain hiccups here and there where there's a lot of hoops to jump through. I'll put it that way with publishing. And so a lot of times articles will go to preprint. So it hasn't been officially published in a journal, but it's still a good peer-reviewed article and it'll appear the same way in that same general format, abstract, intro, methods, results, discussion, etc. So those are some things that you can find online. Happy reading.
Happy reading.
So thanks, Sarah. That was a lot of information.
I know, I tried to not ramble too long, but
no, it's good. It's good because there's a lot out there, isn't there? There's a lot to tackle. One thing I'd want to add that I don't know how I learned this, but it's actually, so instead of RXIV, it's pronounced archive.
Is
the
it?
X is
Oh
actually
my
the Greek
gosh.
letter chi. Yeah,
Really?
yeah. So because it's done by scientists, there's Greek letters thrown in there unnecessarily. in the most typical scientist way possible, we have a Greek letter thrown in there. So yeah, it's pronounced the letter R, the letter chi, and then Ive because, of course, it is because it's just archive.
That makes it a whole lot easier because I've only ever heard RXIV. So I'll say archive now. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's super. It's a terrible science pun. That's what it is. I feel like maybe we should have brought that up in the names episode. It's just like a ridiculous name, but there you go. I feel like there was like a couple other things. We'll see if anyone else got anything to touch on.
Sarah, I think you did a great job covering that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, I did have one other thing to touch on. It was totally kind of just a quip, but least favorite journal for giant figures.
Are you asking me a question like that?
I have one
man.
journal in my mind that has no.
Go for it. What is it? What's
I was
yours?
just thinking about Cell.
Okay.
Cell, and they're like parts A through Z figures. I'm sure there's a Cell paper out there that goes like A, and it goes to Z, and they have to start finding new letters. Or like. So Sarah, you touched on reviews a little bit and like talking about like kind of how peer review works, but I think next up we'll have Joe talk a little bit more about where papers come from. So the process that happens before papers even get online and where you can actually find them.
Yeah, sure. So, kind of, even before that, I kind of just want to share a little bit about my like an anecdote about my own experience in the lab. I'm working to help understand how a potential cancer drug might work. And so, like, it's not actually a drug for treating patients yet, but we're trying to develop it and understand how like it works in cells, to see if we can actually use it as a drug for cancer patients. But one day, like a new paper came out. It was a big deal. And this was a paper from a lab that was in another country, and they had kind of come across what may have been the actual way that our drug was working, and we were like, oh my gosh, wow, this is a big deal. And like I got the paper, and I like the way I kind of tend to read papers is like I'll start reading the abstract, and there's usually it's a long, dense. Like if you get the whole full paper, it can be a very very long PDF. So I'll start with the abstract. I'll read that to get like a general sense or a theme of the paper, and then I'll go into the introduction, kind of just like the introduction often talks about like kind of why people are researching the subject of this paper in the first place, and why ask the research questions that they're asking in the paper. And um, then I'll often go to the next up, kind of the results from their experiments, and kind of just like oftentimes these results have like they often like just show like as Sam was mentioning, like pretty figures that kind of show like their like what they learned from their experiments and things like that. And then kind of just oftentimes they'll have their own interpretation of this data in there. And then I'll go to the discussion, which kind of oftentimes will wrap up the point of the paper and just talk about like the main idea from the paper and where things might be headed next. And also that will kind of tie into the conclusion as well, which is usually like a short paragraph that really, really wraps it up. But honestly, the most important part of a paper, which is often hard to understand if you're not necessarily working in the exact same field, is the method section. Oftentimes, like when I'm reading the results, I'll see, they have like this cancer cell line with supposedly this new gene that they stuck into the cancer cells. And how did they do that? Like I know the way that I stick genes into cancer cells, but how did they do it? And so I'll go to the methods and look to see like how they did it, and they'll talk about how they did it, hopefully in a way that if it's a good paper, other scientists can do the exact same thing themselves. And I think that's a very very important part. And then also at the very end of the paper, they'll include citations where they'll kind of just talk about like all the sources that they got ideas and information from as well. And like they'll have like little notes throughout the whole paper, just like citing different ideas. And at the very end, you have this big list of all of these different papers. So if you're interested in reading more, kind of going in, checking all the different sources that people cite, kind of like what Natalie mentioned earlier in the beginning, you go down to the very bottom of these big research papers, and you can find that list of citations. And one thing, the reason I bring this up was because I was reading the paper, and I was just like, I saw some of the results, and I said, okay, if this is actually how the drug works, then we should probably try it ourselves to see if like this actually works in our hands, like in our own lab in our own experiment, like doing the exact same with the exact same conditions, the exact same methods. Do we get the same results? And so I actually went, and my supervisor and I went and did some of the experiments that they did, and we actually got slightly different results, which was surprising. And maybe we did something a tiny bit different. Maybe we didn't, but it go to show the importance of replication and replication studies. So these experiments that my supervisor and I did aren't necessarily going to be published, but we had to do these experiments to kind of just get a sense of, is the paper correct or not? And obviously you don't do that all the time in science, but it's very important to do it when you can. And it's very important to, like, when you're reading through research papers, as Natalie and Sarah mentioned earlier, just like, if you see a result and you're curious about it, go and find other papers that can either corroborate or refute that. I think that's very, very important. And kind of going back to the idea of reviews, there are actually multiple different kinds of reviews. So, like, there are just general, like, literature reviews where they kind of just summarize the results of many different studies. But oftentimes, people writing reviews have a theory or an idea or a hypothesis that they want to get across to a reader. And they'll often cite a lot of sources to show, like, oh, this might be a reasonable area of research to explore further, and this is our rationale. Another kind of review is a systematic review, where, like, you really, like, you have a predefined question that you're really, like, you decide what the question is going to be beforehand, and then you go and kind of, like, find as many studies as you can that kind of will answer that question. And then also, similar to a systematic review, there are meta-analyses, which are kind of like systematic reviews in that you have these meta-analyses have a question. So, for example, like, do blueberries actually prevent cancer, yes or no, as Natalie mentioned. And so, like, people might find all the research that they can on blueberries and cancer, and look at all the different clinical trials that people have done giving people blueberries and seeing whether they get cancer or not. And they'll actually aggregate all that data together from all these different studies and do statistical tests to see if the probability of blueberries actually preventing cancer is more than trivial or is just trivial. So those are some different kinds of other, like, kind of beyond, like, a research paper. Like, there are other additional kinds of scientific papers that often summarize research papers, or kind of look at many different research papers at once. Of course, one thing to keep in mind about a lot of these reviews or meta-analyses is that they're only as good as the information that goes into the review. So if you have very, like, poorly done research papers that are kind of feeding into your meta-analysis, then you might get results in your meta-analysis that aren't necessarily true, or aren't necessarily what you might actually see if you're looking at a larger group of papers. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Another thing that actually a little while later in my lab, after kind of repeating all these studies, we actually we think that the way this drug kills cancer cells actually happens in a slightly different way than what the initial paper I mentioned said. And so we wrote a paper where we kind of, like, we wrote an introduction, we had our methods, we had our like, results in nice pretty figures with, like, a description, and kind of discussed, like, what the results mean, and with, like, a nice little conclusion, all our citations. We took that and we submitted it to multiple different journals. Well, actually, you really are only supposed to submit to one journal at once. So we submitted to the first journal. They actually rejected the paper because they felt that the paper wasn't really within their scope. And so we had to go to another paper or another journal. And so we did that like 5 times. It took a while. Actually, this whole part of the process of actually, like, once you write a paper, like, let's say you put it in bioarchive, once it's up there, sometimes it takes a while before you actually find a journal that is interested in, like, taking it on and publishing it. But eventually we found a journal and some editors that were very interested in our paper. And so they decided, okay, well, this looks interesting. Let's send it out to peer review. And so we actually, they asked us to suggest people like within the field of our cancer biology field that might actually know what they're talking about if they read our paper. And so we suggested some potential reviewers. They picked some of those reviewers and sent our paper out to 3 of them. And it took a few months, it took a little time, but the reviewers eventually got back to us and said, okay, well, this is an interesting point, but you didn't do this experiment and you need to do this experiment to actually prove your point. Because like you have experiment A, but you also need experiment B2 to fully conclude this. And so things along those lines, or hey, have you checked whether this protein is actually involved in the way the drug works? And so we had to respond to that and kind of just say, okay, well, now we've done those experiments. Thank you for your suggestion. Here are the results, and we're going to include them in the final version of the paper. And so that's the stage we're at now. We're wrapping up the final version of the paper, and we're going to resubmit it so that likely if the reviewers agree with our results and think that we've answered our questions or their questions to the degree that they would like, then it will be published. And so it's taken a long time, but that's been my experience with the peer review process so far. It's been very interesting. I will say it seems like for us scientists sometimes like having someone say, you may be wrong, or, oh, you should do this additional thing. Like it can be really frustrating because like, oh, if we've put so much work into this and like we know we're right or things like that. But oftentimes, the vast majority of times, like I've found that the papers that I'm involved with after the peer review process end up being much, much better, much more higher quality than they were before. So I think that's really the power of having different perspectives come to your science, and I think it's definitely really important. It's not perfect. It's not a perfect system, but it's certainly one of the best ways of doing science that we have so far.
I think that's a great story. I like how you interwove all that together in your experiences.
Thank you.
Yeah, I haven't been lucky enough to get to the point where I've got a first author paper or a paper where like I'm intimately involved in publishing it. But I do know that like there's kind of this trope of that one of the reviewers is really nasty, and it's usually reviewer number 2. It's kind of a running joke.
For us, it was a different number reviewer. Surprisingly.
But I've had multiple times where I've had people who are in my lab or I'm close to other ways where like publishing papers, and it was like pretty usually reviewer number 2 who was like, no, you're just wrong. Like you got to do this other thing. And it's like, but I have this good data. It is interesting because peer review, it can go so many different ways. So, I mean, yeah, it does improve the quality of science to have a bunch of people look at it. But sometimes one reviewer may have biases or may have very strong opinions. But I guess it just goes to show that science is a thing that human beings do. And people will react the way people do to things.
Yeah. Additionally, like I think sometimes that's when the editor comes in and kind of like they'll take everything together and kind of synthesize it all as to whether it should be published or not.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's hard to answer all of those. My observations, it's hard to answer all of those requests from reviewers. But
yeah, I think there were some questions where we were like, this is not within the scope of this paper, we said it in a nice way, but there were some questions that it was very clear these people researched something they research we researched Schlafen 12. They research a different Schlafen. Schlafen is a protein in this case. It also means the German word. It's the German word to sleep, which is interesting. But these proteins don't really make you sleep. but they study other schlafens. They're like, oh, can you compare this? This schlafen to other schlafens? And we did some work to like do that comparison, but that's really like an entire other paper. So yeah.
I wanted to also quickly mention open access articles, because I think those are super important to advancing science. And I was just reminded with our talk about journals and everything. I'm sorry if I said that bioRxiv, medRxiv were peer-reviewed. They are not necessarily. However, any article that is in a preprint is open access by default, which is really nice, at least in my experiences. And for those who don't know, or who are delving into reading scientific articles for the first time, if an article you come across is not open access, or you're only able to read like an abstract and part of the intro, if you reach out to the authors directly, they will likely give you that article for free. So just PSA, I think that's super important. I've actually done that before myself when I needed to, and it's definitely useful.
Yeah, because publishers will often charge a lot of money for you to be able to see an article, and that's a shame because I'm sure a lot of our listeners are not actually academics or people who have access to all of these papers. So it's an important thing to point out that if you happen to stumble across an article, you can often email the authors and be like, hey, can I get a look at this? There'll often be a bioRxiv copy of it. PubMed also has their own sort of like preprint archive. Those are before the printed versions. Sometimes the figures aren't formatted nicely. And it's frustrating, like the final version isn't always that accessible. That is changing. There are journals that are open access, but we'll have to see where that goes in the future. Yeah, and I don't know if anyone's got anything else to add about Joe's bit here. But for those of you who have stuck through this and you're like, okay, so now I know a whole bunch about papers, I just want to talk a little bit about some stuff that I'm honestly not an expert at. And that's just kind of some fun things that I've found bumbling around on the internet. So I am someone who has spent quite a lot of time on the internet finding things. And I actually, when I was trying to do some research on something that was actually relevant to what I was doing in the lab at the time, I stumbled upon a bunch of articles about what I now refer to as dairy law. So I am not an expert of food science, but I had found this paper. I was looking for something about something called protein cross-linking. So proteins can stick to one another when you heat them up, cool them down. That's how Jell-O works. That's how agros work. So like we'll make like Petri plates. They have like this goo in them. It's actually also just kind of vegan Jell-O. It's edible, weirdly enough, for scientists. I'm sure probably some listeners have cooked with it. But cross-linking is also essential for regulating how melty cheese is. So there was a paper, a patent, which, so speaking of open access, all patents are public, as far as I'm aware. There's a patent for pretty much American cheese, so Kraft singles, literally from the Kraft company, talking about regulating the cross-linking of cheese to regulate how melty it is. And they had this whole like experimental setup to determine the meltiness of cheese. And what's fascinating about all of these sorts of things is that you can actually find some really reputable sources on stuff that you're not necessarily an expert on pretty easily with the internet, so the scope of it. I'm sure we've all found things that aren't particularly reputable, like, well, this is garbage. But patents are a super valuable source because they are, to some degree, peer-reviewed by, I think, the U.S. Patent Office, if I'm understanding patent law well. Again, I'm like so far from a patent lawyer. But they're essentially papers published by companies and individuals, and the question I've heard a lot of times is American cheese cheese? And if you look at the original, I think it was 1916 patent from James Kraft himself, it's actually just super pasteurized cheese. So the original reason to make American cheese was because cheese goes bad, gets moldy, and if you boil it, it pasteurizes. And if you do it exactly the right way, it doesn't like turn into a big bunch of goo. It turns into American cheese. It cross-links, turns into kind of jellyish, like more jello-y consistency, which is really good for making things like grilled cheese. Similarly, in the category of dairy law, there's actually a whole bunch of U.S. Legal documents in the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations that pertain to things like cheese and also ice cream. So, weirdly enough, ice cream is a very strictly defined thing in U.S. law. It has to have a very specific milk content. It has very specific fat content, very specific like milk contents by weight, and if you are under that fat content, you cannot legally consider it ice cream. So gelato is not legally ice cream, for example, because it'll actually form ice crystals if stored too cold, and it has to be served warmer. But there's actually a lot of complicated science, like protein science, material science, actually involved in these things, and but the sources that I found to be super useful are like nothing that I would use in lab. So patents, laws, and on a lot of occasions, trade publications, as well as the occasional article I found on PubMed. But I found this to be just kind of a fascinating rabbit hole to dig down, where you can start answering questions about stuff that you find in your everyday life if you know where to look. So this is like a favorite story of mine, just because it's just kind of out of the ordinary when it comes to talking about sources on science, but still very relevant, considering that I found it when I was actually looking for papers for my own research. Yeah, so if anyone wants to comment on dairy law, if we want to just wrap this up. But
I gotta say, it's pretty cheesy.
Oh,
we're leaving that in, by the
Joe. Oh yeah, we're totally leaving that in.
We're also
gonna
leaving
need to edit in a
way. Yeah.
Hello, listeners. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks for
Here's your
listening.
reward for listening us talk for the past half hour, or however long it's been.
Thank you for enduring.
Yeah.
Sam, I must say, I'm quite motivated to read about cheese patent law now.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, the original Kraft patent has some really funny bits, because it's like old-timey and talking about cheese, and some of these phrases are not things that it gets me if I'm reading it, I'm like tired enough of reading it, but this is funny. Like some patents, a lot of patents are really boring, where it's like, you know, I propose a method for making this lever move a certain way, and this one's like, so it's true cheesy nature, and it's like acting as if you know about cheese. It's like, who knows about cheese like that? It's like a very know-it-all early 1900s businessman writing about cheese. It's quality. Yeah, so thank you all for listening. I think we already plugged our Twitter.
Let us know online if you think our content is Gouda or could brie better. There you go.
You're a genius.
Yeah, thanks so much for listening. And hope you'll tune in next time.